The bustling streets of the city were alive with the sounds of ambition, but for Emily Carter, life often felt stagnant. She lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city with her younger brother, Max, and her ailing mother, Diana. Every morning, Emily donned her waitress uniform and braved the long commute to La Belle Époque, an upscale restaurant frequented by the city's elite. The job paid enough to keep the lights on, but it was far from the life she had envisioned for herself. Emily's heart belonged to music. Her love for the violin had been kindled by her grandfather, a passionate musician who had once dreamed of performing on the world's grandest stages. Though his dreams had been unfulfilled, he had passed on his battered yet beloved violin to Emily before his death. It was more than just an instrument. It was a reminder of her roots, her potential, and the dreams she still harbored. Yet those dreams seemed increasingly out of reach. Despite countless hours of practice and natural talent, Emily's family's financial struggles had forced her to give up on attending music school. Each rejection letter from scholarships and conservatories felt like another door slamming shut on her aspirations. Even so, Emily found solace in playing. Late at night, after long shifts at the restaurant, she would sit by the apartment window, letting her music spill out into the quiet streets below. Her melodies carried the weight of her emotions, her frustrations, her hopes, and the love she felt for her family. At the restaurant, Emily often caught glimpses of the life she wished for. As she served glasses of fine wine and delicate plates of hors d'oeuvres to the wealthy patrons, she imagined herself performing on the stages they casually discussed. It wasn't envy she felt, it was determination. Somewhere deep within her, Emily knew she had the talent to belong in their world. But determination wasn't always enough. The reality of her life was relentless. Her mother's medical bills were mounting, and Max needed support for his education. Emily was torn between her responsibilities and her dreams, often wondering if she'd made the right sacrifices. One rainy evening, as she finished her shift, Emily overheard a conversation between two diners about an upcoming event at the Aldridge estate, a charity gala known for its extravagant displays of wealth and exclusive guest list. She couldn't have known then how that night would change her life. Her path might have seemed unremarkable to those who passed her by, but Emily's story was just beginning. Somewhere beyond the mundane rhythm of her days, destiny waited. And soon, the sound of her violin would echo far beyond her small apartment, reaching ears she never imagined. The Aldridge estate stood like a gleaming fortress on the hill, its towering spires and manicured gardens a testament to wealth and power. That night, it hosted the annual charity gala, an event synonymous with opulence and exclusivity. The crème de la crème of society gathered beneath glittering chandeliers, sipping champagne and exchanging thinly veiled pleasantries. Emily arrived at the estate as part of the catering staff. Dressed in a crisp white blouse and black skirt, she blended seamlessly into the background, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and champagne flutes. The grandeur of the estate was overwhelming. Golden light spilled from ornate windows, and the soft hum of a string quartet filled the air. For a fleeting moment, Emily imagined herself among the musicians, her violin resonating in harmony with their notes. But reality quickly pulled her back. She wasn't here to dream. She was here to work. Victor Aldridge, the evening's host, was a man whose reputation preceded him. The son of a real estate tycoon, he had inherited not just immense wealth, but also a cold, calculating demeanor. Victor's sharp wit often teetered into cruelty, and his amusement was frequently at the expense of others. As he surveyed the room, his piercing blue eyes settled on Emily, her poised movements catching his attention. "Waitress," he called out, his voice cutting through the low murmur of conversation. Emily froze, tray in hand, before reluctantly stepping forward. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. Victor studied her for a moment, a sly smile curling his lips. "Tell me, do you play the violin?" Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how he knew, but his question felt like a trap. I do, sir," she replied cautiously. "Perfect," Victor drawled, his voice laced with mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, raising his glass to the crowd, "it seems our waitress has a hidden talent. What better entertainment than an impromptu performance?" A wave of laughter rippled through the room, though some guests exchanged uneasy glances. "I don't think that's," Emily began, but Victor cut her off. "Nonsense. Surely you're not shy. After all, this is a charity event. Think of it as your contribution." Her cheeks burned with humiliation, and she wanted nothing more than to vanish. Yet, something in his tone, a mix of derision and challenge, ignited a spark within her. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a musician, and she didn't owe Victor or his guests an apology for her existence. "I'll need a violin," she said, her voice steady despite the knots in her stomach. Victor raised an eyebrow, impressed by her resolve. With a snap of his fingers, one of the musicians in the quartet reluctantly handed Emily their instrument. The room fell silent as she stepped into the center, the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes bearing down on her. Taking a deep breath, Emily positioned the violin beneath her chin and closed her eyes. The first notes trembled as her hands betrayed her nerves. A few quiet snickers broke out among the crowd, but she refused to falter. Slowly, the melody grew, its timbre shifting from uncertain to commanding. The music swelled, filling the grand hall with a hauntingly beautiful tune that seemed to wrap itself around each listener. Emily poured her soul into every stroke of the bow, weaving a story of pain, hope, and resilience. The laughter died away, replaced by an awed silence. Even Victor, who had expected a clumsy performance, found himself captivated. When the final note faded into the air, the room erupted in applause. For the first time in years, Emily felt seen, not as a waitress or a struggling young woman, but as an artist. Her chest heaved, and her hands trembled, but she held her head high, meeting Victor's gaze with quiet defiance. Victor approached her, his usual smug expression replaced by something unreadable. "Impressive," he said, his voice softer than before. Yet, his words carried an edge, as if he were unsettled by what he'd just witnessed. Before Emily could respond, another man stepped forward, a distinguished figure with silver hair and an air of authority. "Miss," he said, his voice warm, "that was extraordinary. My name is Samuel Morgan, and I'm the conductor of the Philharmonic Orchestra. I'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." Emily's breath caught. The room, the crowd, even Victor seemed to fade into the background. For the first time, her dreams felt within reach. But as Samuel extended his hand, she hesitated, the weight of her reality pulling her back. Could she truly take this leap? The applause from the audience still echoed in Emily's ears as she stood frozen in the spotlight, Samuel Morgan's words lingering in her mind. The conductor of the Philharmonic Orchestra had just extended an opportunity, a chance to escape the confines of her daily struggles and pursue her long-buried dream. Yet the weight of her life's responsibilities loomed large, casting a shadow over her hope. I'm honored," Emily stammered, glancing at the crowd of onlookers. Their faces were a mix of admiration, curiosity, and faint skepticism. "But I'm not sure if I'm ready for something like this." Samuel's warm smile didn't falter. "Talent like yours can't be hidden away, Miss Carter." "Emily Carter," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well, Miss Carter," Samuel continued, "I've seen many musicians in my time, and I can tell you this, readiness comes with opportunity. Let me offer you an audition. The rest is up to you." He handed her a card with his contact information, the weight of his sincerity evident in his tone. Before Emily could respond, the sharp, cold voice of Victor Aldridge cut through the air. "Well, isn't this a fairy tale moment?" He stepped closer, his piercing eyes locking onto Emily. "But let's not forget this evening isn't about personal dreams. It's a charity event, after all." The room tensed at Victor's words, but Emily held her ground, her earlier humiliation fueling a quiet defiance. "You're right, Mr. Aldridge," she said evenly, meeting his gaze. "But music can inspire generosity, can't it?" Victor tilted his head, momentarily disarmed by her response. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. "Touché," he said, before turning to the crowd with an exaggerated clap. "A round of applause for our talented waitress, ladies and gentlemen." The room erupted into cheers once more, though the moment felt surreal to Emily. She handed the violin back to the musician, her fingers trembling slightly as she did so. Samuel gave her a reassuring nod before disappearing into the throng of guests. As the night wore on, Emily resumed her duties, her mind spinning with the events that had just unfolded. The applause, Samuel's offer, Victor's unnerving gaze. It all felt like a dream she couldn't fully grasp. But as she served the guests, snippets of conversation reached her ears. She played beautifully, one woman murmured to her companion. Unbelievable talent for someone so ordinary, said another. Samuel Morgan must be serious if he's offering her an audition, a man whispered. Their words were a mix of praise and condescension, but Emily focused on the praise. For the first time in years, she felt as though the world had noticed her, even if only for a fleeting moment. Later, as she stood by the kitchen doors taking a moment to breathe, Victor appeared beside her. She hadn't seen him approach, and his presence startled her. "You're quite the enigma, Miss Carter," he said, his tone softer than before. "Tell me, where did you learn to play like that?" Emily hesitated, unsure of his intentions. "My grandfather taught me. He loved music, and he passed that love on to me." Victor's expression flickered, a hint of something unspoken crossing his features. "And yet you're here, serving canapes instead of performing on stage. Why?" His question stung, though Emily sensed no malice in it. "Because life doesn't always give us a choice," she replied simply. Victor studied her for a moment before nodding. "Perhaps, but sometimes, life gives us moments. Like tonight. What you do with them is up to you." With that, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Emily more perplexed than ever. As the event came to a close and Emily prepared to leave, she clutched Samuel's card tightly in her hand. The night had been a whirlwind of emotions, but one thing was clear. She couldn't ignore the opportunity in front of her. Standing in the grand hall of the Aldridge estate, surrounded by remnants of a world she barely understood, Emily made a silent promise to herself. No matter how uncertain or daunting the path ahead seemed, she would take her violin and give it everything she had. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the worn curtains of Emily's small apartment, but she remained lost in thought. Samuel Morgan's card sat on the kitchen table, its crisp edges a stark contrast to the chipped surface beneath. Her younger brother, Max, hovered nearby, watching her with concern. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the card. Emily sighed, running her fingers through her messy hair. "An opportunity," she replied, though her tone was heavy with uncertainty. Max picked up the card, squinting at the elegant script. "Samuel Morgan? Isn't he, like, famous or something?" "He's the conductor of the Philharmonic Orchestra," Emily explained, a flicker of awe creeping into her voice. "He offered me an audition last night." Max's eyes widened. "An audition? That's amazing. You've been waiting for something like this forever." "I know," she said softly, her gaze distant, "but I don't know if I'm ready. I've been out of practice, and what if I'm not good enough?" Max frowned. "You've always been good enough. You just need to believe it. Grandpa used to say your music could move mountains." His words stirred a bittersweet ache in her chest. Her grandfather had been her biggest supporter, always insisting that her talent was something special. Yet, the weight of her family's struggles and her own insecurities had often drowned out his encouragement. Emily's mother, Diana, shuffled into the kitchen, her frail form supported by a cane. She glanced at the card and then at Emily, her tired eyes softening with understanding. "You should call him," Diana said, her voice gentle but firm. Emily looked at her mother, guilt and determination warring within her. "But what about you and Max? I can't just—" Diana interrupted, her tone resolute. "We'll manage. You've spent so much of your life putting us first, Emily. It's time you did something for yourself." Her mother's words struck a chord, and Emily felt the first stirrings of hope break through her doubt. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed the number on Samuel's card. The conversation was brief but encouraging. Samuel was delighted to hear from her and arranged for her to audition in 2 weeks at the Philharmonic's rehearsal hall. As she hung up, a mix of exhilaration and fear coursed through her veins. This was it, a chance to prove herself. Over the next few days, Emily dedicated herself to preparing for the audition. Her grandfather's old violin, worn but beloved, became her constant companion. She practiced tirelessly in the small living room, her fingers dancing across the strings as she tried to perfect every note. However, the challenges quickly became apparent. Her technique was rusty, and her nerves often got the better of her. Late at night, doubts crept in, whispering that she wasn't good enough, that she'd embarrass herself in front of the orchestra. One evening, as she practiced a particularly difficult piece, the door creaked open and Max peeked inside. "That sounded amazing," he said, stepping into the room. Emily set down her violin with a frustrated sigh. "It's not good enough. I keep messing up." Max sat beside her, his expression serious. "You're too hard on yourself. You've got something those other musicians don't have." "And what's that?" she asked, her tone tinged with skepticism. "Heart," Max said simply. "You play like you mean every note. That's what makes you special." His words brought tears to her eyes, and she hugged him tightly. "Thanks, Max. I needed that." As the audition day approached, Emily's confidence slowly began to grow. She reminded herself of why she loved music, how it had always been her way of expressing what words couldn't. This wasn't just about impressing an orchestra. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she had almost lost. Finally, the day arrived. Dressed in her best, Emily stood outside the grand rehearsal hall, her violin case clutched tightly in her hand. The imposing building loomed before her, its marble facade a reminder of the world she was about to step into. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy doors and entered. Inside, the air buzzed with the hum of activity as musicians prepared for their rehearsals. Samuel Morgan greeted her warmly, his presence reassuring. "Welcome, Emily," he said with a smile. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. Samuel led her to the stage, where the orchestra members were seated, their curious eyes fixed on her. Emily took her place, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared to play. Closing her eyes, she let the world fall away, focusing solely on the music. The first notes emerged tentative but steady, and as she continued, her confidence grew. Her violin sang with emotion, each note a reflection of her journey, her struggles, her dreams, and her determination. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. Samuel's face beamed with approval, and several musicians nodded in admiration. "You have something rare, Emily," Samuel said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "You play with your soul." Tears welled in her eyes as she realized she had taken the first step toward a new chapter in her life. For the first time, the future felt like a melody waiting to be written, and she was ready to play it. As Emily walked out of the rehearsal hall, violin case in hand, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. The applause from the orchestra still rang in her ears, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe she was capable of achieving something extraordinary. She had poured her heart into her audition, and Samuel's approval felt like validation of her grandfather's unwavering faith in her talent. Yet, amidst the glow of her small triumph, a familiar figure waited by the curb. Victor Aldridge leaned casually against his sleek black car, his sharp suit immaculate as always. His presence immediately put Emily on edge, her steps faltering as their eyes met. "Miss Carter," Victor greeted her smoothly, straightening as she approached. "I trust the audition went well?" Emily's brow furrowed. "What are you doing here, Mr. Aldridge?" Victor's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'm curious, that's all. Your performance the other night was unexpected, and I wanted to see if you could replicate it under less fortuitous circumstances." The subtle challenge in his tone made Emily bristle. "If you came here to critique me, you're wasting your time." "On the contrary," Victor replied, stepping closer. "I came because I wanted to understand. That melody you played, it was familiar to me. Hauntingly so." Emily's heartbeat quickened. "Familiar? How?" Victor hesitated for the first time, his confident demeanor giving way to something more guarded. "It was a piece my mother used to play," he admitted, his voice quieter now. She passed away when I was young, but I'll never forget her music. Hearing it again, it stirred something in me. Emily's grip tightened on her violin case. That melody has been in my family for generations. My grandfather taught it to me, and he said it was written by someone close to him. Victor's expression darkened as he processed her words. Then perhaps there's a connection between our families, one I wasn't aware of. Emily regarded him warily. Why does it matter to you? For a moment, Victor seemed unsure of how to respond. Then, his gaze softened, and he spoke with uncharacteristic sincerity. Because it reminded me of a time when my life wasn't all about power and control, when music meant something more than just entertainment. That night when you played, it brought back memories I thought I'd buried. Emily studied him carefully. The arrogant, condescending man from the charity event was still there, but now she glimpsed something deeper, a vulnerability he was clearly unused to showing. Music has a way of doing that, she said cautiously. It can connect us to the past, to people we've lost. But it's not just about remembering, it's about moving forward too. Victor nodded slowly, as though her words struck a chord within him. Perhaps you're right, and perhaps that's why I owe you an apology. Emily blinked, startled. An apology? For how I treated you at the charity event, Victor admitted, his tone surprisingly humble. It was cruel and unnecessary. I underestimated you, and for that, I'm sorry. The sincerity in his voice caught Emily off guard. She had braced herself for another verbal sparring match, not this unexpected vulnerability. I appreciate your apology, she said after a moment, her voice steady. But I didn't play that night to prove anything to you. I did it because music is the only way I know how to express myself. It's not about winning anyone's approval. Victor's smile returned, faint but genuine. Perhaps that's what makes you different, and why your music has the power to affect people in ways mine never could. Emily tilted her head. Yours? Victor gestured toward his car, a flicker of self-deprecation in his expression. Once upon a time, I played the piano. My mother taught me, but after she passed, I stopped. It felt meaningless without her. His admission surprised Emily, adding yet another layer to the enigma that was Victor Aldrich. For all his wealth and arrogance, there was a part of him that was still deeply human, still mourning a loss he couldn't fully articulate. You should play again, Emily said softly. Music isn't meaningless, even when it hurts. Sometimes, that's when it matters the most. Victor studied her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Maybe I will, he said, his voice quiet. But in the meantime, I'd like to help you, if you'll let me. Emily raised an eyebrow. Help me? Why? Because I believe in investing in talent, he replied smoothly, though there was an undertone of genuine intent. And because I suspect your story isn't finished yet. Consider it my way of making amends. Emily hesitated. Victor Aldrich was a man she barely knew, and trusting him felt like a risk. But his apology and the vulnerability he'd shown made her pause. I'll think about it, she said finally. Victor nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. Fair enough. When you're ready, you know where to find me. With that, he stepped into his car and drove away, leaving Emily standing on the sidewalk, her mind racing with possibilities. As she walked home, her thoughts drifted to the melody that had connected them, a piece of music that seemed to carry a history neither of them fully understood. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a coincidence. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would unravel secrets, forge unlikely alliances, and change the course of her life forever. The day of Emily's audition with the Philharmonic Orchestra arrived like a storm, sudden, overwhelming, and filled with energy she didn't know how to contain. She had barely slept the night before, her thoughts looping endlessly between excitement and fear. Now, as she stood in the grand rehearsal hall, the magnitude of the opportunity loomed large before her. The hall was magnificent, its high ceilings adorned with intricate carvings and its walls lined with framed photographs of legendary musicians who had graced the stage. Emily clutched her grandfather's violin case tightly, her palms damp with nervous sweat. You'll be fine, Samuel Morgan said warmly as he greeted her at the entrance to the stage. His presence was steadying, a reassuring anchor amid the swirling storm of her emotions. Remember, you're here because you belong here. Emily nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. The rehearsal hall was bustling with activity. Members of the orchestra tuned their instruments, their casual camaraderie a stark contrast to Emily's rigid nerves. When Samuel introduced her to the group, a mix of polite smiles and curious glances met her. Some musicians seemed skeptical, their raised eyebrows and whispered exchanges betraying their doubts. Emily couldn't blame them. She was an outsider, a waitress with no formal training stepping into their world. "Let's begin," Samuel said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Emily, take your place." The stage felt massive as Emily stepped into the spotlight. She took out her grandfather's violin, her fingers brushing the worn wood with a sense of familiarity and comfort. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself, and then raised the bow to the strings. The first notes emerged hesitant, trembling like a bird unsure of its wings. The weight of the audience's expectations pressed heavily on her shoulders, and her nerves tightened her movements. A wrong note slipped in, jarring against the melody she was trying to build. A soft cough from one of the violinists in the back row made her falter further. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and for a moment, she considered putting down her instrument and walking away. But then she remembered Max's words, "You play like you mean every note." And her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Music is your truth, Emily. Let it speak." Taking a deep breath, she steadied her hands and began again. This time, she let the music flow from a deeper place. She stopped trying to impress the room and instead played for herself, for the little girl who had dreamed of this moment, for the grandfather who had believed in her, and for the mother and brother who had sacrificed so much. The melody swelled, rich and full of emotion. It wasn't perfect. There were still tiny flaws, a note slightly off or a transition that lacked polish. But the heart behind the music was unmistakable. It filled the hall, weaving a tapestry of raw, unfiltered feeling. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, and then Samuel began to clap. Slowly, the rest of the orchestra joined in, some reluctantly, others with genuine appreciation. "Well done, Miss Carter," Samuel said, his smile broad and approving. "You brought something special to that performance. It wasn't just music, it was a story, and that's what we need." Emily's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. She had done it. She had faced her fears and let her music speak for itself. As the musicians began packing up their instruments, a violinist in her early 30s approached Emily. She had a kind face and an easy smile. "You've got something, you know," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Claire, second violin. Welcome to the orchestra." Emily shook her hand, grateful for the gesture. "Thank you. That means a lot." "Don't let the others intimidate you," Claire added, lowering her voice. "Some of them can be critical, but they'll come around once they see how much heart you bring to the music." Emily smiled, her earlier apprehension beginning to fade. For the first time, she felt like she might actually belong here. As she packed up her violin, Samuel approached her again. "You've earned a place here, Emily," he said, "but the work has just begun. This is only the first step in a very long journey." "I understand," Emily replied, her voice steady, "and I'm ready." Outside the hall, the crisp air hit her cheeks, refreshing and invigorating. She looked up at the sky, feeling a rare sense of hope bloom within her. Yet, as she walked home, her thoughts returned to Victor Aldridge and the strange connection they seemed to share. The melody that had drawn their lives together still lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her journey was only beginning to uncover its secrets. The days following Emily's audition were a whirlwind of emotions and preparation. Her acceptance into the Philharmonic Orchestra felt like a dream, one she was only beginning to believe was real. Rehearsals began immediately, each session testing her limits as a musician. Though the pressure was immense, Emily found herself thriving, spurred on by the encouragement of Samuel and her growing connection with her fellow musicians. But amidst the joy and challenges of her new chapter, a shadow loomed. Victor Aldridge. She hadn't seen him since their conversation outside the rehearsal hall, But his words and his unexpected vulnerability lingered in her mind. She couldn't quite reconcile the cruel man who had humiliated her at the gala with the one who had stood before her, haunted by memories of his mother and offering an apology. Her thoughts were interrupted one crisp autumn afternoon when a sleek black car pulled up outside the cafe where she was grabbing a quick lunch between rehearsals. The door opened, and Victor stepped out, his presence as commanding as ever. Emily froze, her sandwich halfway to her mouth. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her tone cautious. Victor adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit, his expression uncharacteristically subdued. "I came to speak with you. May I sit?" She hesitated, her instincts telling her to be wary. But curiosity won out, and she gestured to the seat across from her. Victor sat down, his movements precise and deliberate. For a moment, he simply studied her, as though searching for the right words. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice low but steady, "for what I did at the gala. It was cruel, unnecessary, and shameful." Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "You already apologized," she reminded him. "Not properly," Victor replied. "That night, I acted out of arrogance and insecurity. I wanted to humiliate you, but instead, I was the one who felt humiliated by my own actions. Your performance, it was extraordinary. It forced me to confront parts of myself I've tried to ignore for years." Emily set her sandwich down, her appetite forgotten. "Why are you telling me this now?" Victor exhaled, his gaze dropping to the table. "Because I can't seem to get that melody out of my head. Hearing it again after all these years, it brought back memories I thought I'd buried. Memories of my mother, of the music she used to play. It reminded me of who I was before I became this." He gestured to himself, his usual confidence tinged with self-reproach. Emily regarded him carefully. "People change, Mr. Aldridge, but it's up to you whether that change is for the better or worse." "Victor," he corrected softly. "Call me Victor." She nodded, though the familiarity felt strange. "Victor, then. I'm glad the music meant something to you, but I still don't understand why you're here." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Because I want to help you, Emily. You have a gift, and I want to make amends by supporting your journey. Whatever you need, resources, connections, funding, it's yours." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Why would you do that? Out of guilt? Or is this another way for you to feel in control?" Victor flinched, the accusation clearly hitting home. "At first, maybe," he admitted. "But now, it's more than that. Your music reminded me of what truly matters. I've spent my life chasing power and wealth, but it's left me empty. Supporting you feels meaningful, like I can finally do something good." Emily studied him, searching for any hint of insincerity. To her surprise, she found none. His apology felt genuine, his words unpolished but heartfelt. "I don't need your money," she said finally, her voice firm. "But if you want to help, then do it because you believe in the music, not because you're trying to redeem yourself." Victor nodded slowly, as though weighing her words. "Fair enough. Then consider me a patron of the arts, not of pity, but of potential." Emily allowed herself a small smile. "We'll see." The conversation shifted, and for the first time, they spoke as equals. Victor shared stories of his mother, a pianist whose music had filled their home with warmth and joy. Emily, in turn, spoke of her grandfather and the melody he had passed down, a piece that now seemed to connect their lives in ways neither fully understood. As the afternoon wore on, Emily found herself seeing Victor in a new light. Beneath the polished exterior and cold demeanor was a man grappling with loss and regret, searching for something to anchor him. When they finally parted ways, Emily felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for Victor as well. Perhaps, like her, he was on the cusp of a transformation, one that would redefine who he was and what he stood for. The day of Emily's first major solo performance with the orchestra arrived, and the atmosphere in the concert hall was electric. The air was thick with anticipation, every inch of the grand venue vibrating with the hum of excitement. The audience filled the seats, a sea of elegant gowns and tailored suits, whispering in hushed tones about the young violinist who had taken the Philharmonic by storm. Backstage, Emily stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the strap of her dress. She had come so far from the nervous waitress she had once been, now poised in the middle of her most significant moment yet. Her heart raced as she looked at her reflection, her grandfather's violin clutched in her hands. "You've got this," Samuel's voice cut through the silence, warm and reassuring. He was standing just behind her, his presence like a shield against her mounting nerves. Emily turned to him, her hands shaking slightly. "What if I mess up?" Samuel chuckled softly. "You won't, but if you do, you'll make it beautiful anyway. Trust yourself, Emily. The music will carry you." She nodded, though the weight of the moment still felt heavy on her shoulders. She could hear the orchestra tuning up in the next room, the sounds of the musicians warming up, their instruments blending together in a cacophony of preparations. When the time came, Samuel gave her a reassuring nod, and Emily stepped out onto the stage. The spotlight hit her like a beam of light from the heavens, blinding at first, but she adjusted quickly. The crowd's applause began to fade as she took her place in front of the orchestra. The conductor raised his baton, and Emily took a deep breath. She glanced out at the audience, her eyes briefly meeting the expectant faces of the elite guests gathered in the first few rows. Among them, she spotted Victor, dressed in his usual dark suit, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. It was strange to see him in such a setting, but it was equally strange to know he was here to support her. The opening notes of the orchestra filled the air, and Emily's moment arrived. She raised her violin, closed her eyes, and let the music guide her. The first few notes were tentative, but as soon as her bow touched the strings, her confidence began to build. The melody she had practiced so tirelessly flowed effortlessly from her fingers, sweeping over the hall like a wave crashing onto the shore. The music was her truth now, the emotion pouring through the strings like nothing else mattered. The audience seemed to fade away. All that existed was the connection between Emily and her violin, between the heartbeats of the orchestra and the rhythm of her soul. She had practiced this piece for months, had bled every ounce of herself into the notes. Now, as she played, she felt the culmination of her struggles, the sleepless nights, the doubt, the rejection, the hunger to be seen. It was all woven into the melody, and with each passing second, Emily poured herself more and more into the music, her body swaying with the flow, her emotions rippling like the strings beneath her fingers. By the time the final movement of the piece arrived, Emily was no longer just playing the violin. She was living it. The crescendo built to a breathtaking peak, and then, with a final, soul-stirring note, she brought the piece to a close. The hall fell into stunned silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen in place as she stood at the center of the stage, holding the final note in the air. Then, the silence broke. The audience erupted into applause, a roaring, standing ovation that filled the hall with deafening sound. Emily's legs nearly buckled beneath her, but she held herself together, bowing deeply as the overwhelming sensation of triumph washed over her. She had done it. She had stood in front of the most prestigious audience in the world, playing her heart out, and they had recognized her. They had seen her for the first time, not just as a waitress or an outsider, but as a gifted violinist. As the applause continued, Emily's eyes searched the crowd, and she found Victor. His expression was unreadable, his usual smug demeanor replaced with something softer, something resembling awe. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and she felt a surge of warmth. Backstage, Emily was greeted by Samuel, Claire, and the other musicians, all congratulating her for the performance of a lifetime. But through it all, her mind kept returning to Victor. She didn't understand what had drawn him here tonight, but she could feel the shift in him, the change that had begun the moment he had heard her play at the gala. "Emily," Samuel said, interrupting her thoughts, "that was incredible. You were perfect out there." "Thanks," she replied, her voice still trembling with the aftermath of the performance. "I couldn't have done it without all of you." But her thoughts were elsewhere, and she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight wasn't just about her music. It was about the connections that were slowly unfolding, the layers of her journey that were revealing themselves one piece at a time. As the crowd began to disperse and the buzz of excitement faded into the night, Emily caught sight of Victor once more. He was making his way toward her, his steps purposeful but unhurried. "I didn't expect that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were beyond words. I've never heard anything like it." Emily couldn't suppress the smile that tugged at the corner of her lips. "Thank you, Victor." For a moment, there was only the two of them, standing in the midst of the aftermath of her success. It was a strange feeling, being seen by him, truly seen, not as the waitress he had once looked down on, but as an artist who had earned her place in this world. "I've come to realize something," Victor continued, his voice quieter now. "Your music, it's not just a gift. It's a force, and I want to help you harness it." Emily's brow furrowed. "How do you mean?" Victor hesitated, as though he were choosing his words carefully. "I'm in a position to open doors for you, Emily. I want to be a part of your success, whether that means supporting your career, connecting you with the right people, or just being there when you need someone to believe in you." She studied him, his sincerity clear in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" He met her gaze directly. "Because I believe in you. And because for the first time in my life, I'm ready to stop living for myself and start living for something that matters." Emily didn't know what to say. She had never expected this. Never expected Victor Aldridge to be standing here, offering her not just an apology, but his support. And yet, somehow, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll think about it." The night had only just begun, but Emily knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of something much bigger than herself. The path ahead was uncertain, but with the support of the people who believed in her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. The concert had been a success beyond Emily's wildest expectations. The applause still echoed in her mind as she made her way back to her dressing room, her heart soaring from the rush of the performance. But amidst the excitement and the admiration, one question lingered in her mind, and it was one that she couldn't shake. The melody, the one that had connected her to Victor in a way she couldn't quite understand. After the concert, Emily had hoped for a quiet moment to herself, to let the performance settle and to reflect. But as she stepped into her dressing room, she found herself confronted by Victor. He was leaning against the doorframe, his dark suit contrasting sharply with the bright lighting of the room. "You were extraordinary," he said, his voice steady but filled with admiration. "I've never heard a performance like that." Emily offered him a small smile. "Thank you, Victor. It means a lot to me." But there was more that needed to be said, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. "Victor," she began, her voice uncertain, "about the melody I played tonight, there's something I need to tell you." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath. "It's a piece that's been passed down in my family for generations. My grandfather taught it to me when I was a child, and I've always played it as a way of honoring him, of keeping a part of him alive." Victor's eyes softened, his gaze intense. "I've heard that melody before." Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" "It's the same melody my mother used to play." Victor's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. She was a musician, pianist, actually, but that melody, it was her favorite, the one she'd play over and over again. She always said it had a special meaning, though she never explained why. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "But that's impossible. My grandfather wrote it." Victor stepped closer, his expression serious. "I'm not saying it's the same melody, but there are striking similarities. The way it flows, the pauses, the emotion in it. It's all too familiar. When I first heard you play it at the gala, I thought it was just a coincidence, but now I'm not so sure." Emily's mind raced. She had always believed the melody to be her grandfather's creation, a piece he had composed for her mother. But the more she thought about it, the more the connection between her family and Victor's began to make sense. Was it possible that their families had shared a deeper bond than she had ever known? "Victor," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly, "you're telling me that your mother—" "She composed it," Victor finished for her. "I'm convinced of it. That piece is her legacy, and now you're playing it, honoring it in a way I never could." I didn't know it was possible for two people to hold such a deep connection through music, but somehow, you and I have found it. Emily felt a whirlwind of emotions: confusion, shock, curiosity, and an overwhelming sense of wonder. She had always known there was something unique about her family's music, but she had never imagined that it could be linked to someone like Victor, someone so removed from her world. "I need to know more," she whispered. "How is it that we both have this melody? How is it that your mother and my grandfather were connected?" Victor's eyes darkened, as if the answer he was about to give might bring even more unsettling revelations. "I don't know yet, Emily, but I intend to find out. My mother never spoke much about her past, about where she learned her music, about the people who shaped her. I thought I knew everything about her, but after hearing you play, I realized there's so much more I don't understand." For a long moment, they stood there, the weight of the mystery hanging between them. Emily could sense the urgency in Victor's voice, the need for answers that went beyond their personal connection. It was as though the melody, the music itself, had become a bridge to uncovering something far greater than either of them had imagined. "I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable position," Victor said, his voice softening, "but I need your help. I need to know everything about that melody, everything you know about it, about your grandfather, about how it came to be. I have to find the truth." Emily hesitated. She didn't fully understand what Victor was asking, or what it would mean for their families, but there was something compelling in his plea, something that tugged at her heart. "I'll help you," she said, her voice resolute, "but we need to be careful. There's too much at stake." Victor nodded, his expression serious. "I know, but I'm willing to take the risk if it means uncovering the truth about my mother's past, and about this melody that seems to link our lives together." The gravity of their conversation hung in the air as they exchanged a final look of determination. Emily knew that this was no longer just about music. It was about something far deeper. It was about discovering a hidden legacy, about unearthing the past that had been carefully buried for so long. As they parted ways that evening, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that their journey together had only just begun. The melody that had started as a simple tribute to her grandfather was now the key to unraveling a mystery that had the power to change everything. And Emily, though still uncertain of where it would lead, knew that the answers were out there, waiting to be found. The days that followed Emily's performance and the discovery of the melody were filled with an unsettling mixture of anticipation and confusion. Victor had promised to find the answers they both sought, and Emily had agreed to help, though she wasn't entirely sure what that would entail. The mystery of the melody that linked their families now overshadowed everything else, and despite the exhilaration of her newfound success, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to take another unexpected turn. Victor's investigations began almost immediately. His resources were vast. He had access to documents, records, and connections that Emily could never have imagined. The first step was tracing the history of the melody itself, something Emily had never considered before. She had always known it as a personal piece, passed down from her grandfather, but never thought to look further into its origins. For days, Victor combed through historical archives, family records, and old concert programs, searching for anything that could shed light on the connection between Emily's family and his mother's past. During this time, Emily's role was to provide what little information she had about her grandfather, his career as a violinist, his time spent touring, and the story of how the melody had come to her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Victor called Emily into his office. He had found something. "I think I've discovered the truth," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he held out a dusty folder filled with yellowed papers. Emily sat down across from him, her heart racing. She had 1,000 questions, but she kept them silent, waiting for Victor to speak. "This document," he began, "is a letter from my mother to her mentor. It's dated several months before her death, and it contains something crucial. My mother spoke of a violinist she had met during her youth, a man who had taught her a melody, a piece she said changed the course of her life." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "It's the same melody?" Victor nodded. "Yes. And the name of the violinist she spoke of was none other than your grandfather." The revelation hit Emily like a wave crashing against the shore. She had known her grandfather had been well respected in the music world, but the idea that he had mentored Victor's mother, that the two families were bound together in such a deep, unexpected way, was more than she could have ever imagined. Victor continued, his voice trembling with disbelief. My mother never spoke of him after their meeting, but she referred to him as a musical soul, someone who had inspired her in ways she couldn't put into words. She never mentioned the name of the melody or where it came from, but she made it clear that it had been a turning point for her. And now, Emily, we know why. Your grandfather's influence reached farther than you ever realized. The silence in the room was thick with the weight of the discovery. Emily struggled to process the gravity of what Victor had just shared. Her grandfather had been part of Victor's mother's life, guiding her, influencing her in ways that Emily had never known. And somehow, all these years later, the melody that had bridged their worlds was still carrying its magic, connecting their families once again. As she absorbed the truth, something deeper began to stir within her. Her connection to Victor was no longer just about music. It was about history, legacy, and the bond that had always existed between their families, even if it had been hidden for so long. We need to meet with my father, Victor said, snapping Emily out of her reverie. He may have more information. He was close to my mother, and I'm sure there are things about their past that we've both missed. Emily nodded, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. There was more to uncover, and the path forward was unclear. But one thing was certain. The truth about her grandfather, about Victor's mother, and about the melody they shared was now intertwined with her own destiny. The next day, they arranged a meeting with Victor's father, Charles Aldrich. The elder Aldrich was a man of great influence, known not only for his wealth, but also for his historical knowledge of the music world. If anyone could help them understand the deeper connections between their families, it was Charles. When they arrived at the Aldrich estate, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the grandeur of the place. The mansion was vast, its walls lined with portraits of musicians, composers, and artists who had shaped the cultural landscape over the centuries. It was a world far removed from the simple life she had known, but somehow, it felt like a place she belonged now. No longer just an outsider, but a part of something much larger than herself. Charles Aldrich greeted them with a reserved smile, his sharp eyes studying Emily as they shook hands. He was a tall, imposing man, with a presence that made him impossible to ignore. But there was a certain warmth in his gaze when he looked at Victor, a quiet pride that seemed to soften his otherwise stern demeanor. "Victor, Emily," Charles said, his voice deep and measured, "what brings you here today?" Victor wasted no time in getting to the point. "Father, we've discovered something remarkable. Emily's grandfather, the violinist who mentored my mother, he was the one who taught her the melody we've been investigating." Charles's expression shifted, and Emily could see the wheels turning in his mind. "I see," he said slowly, his tone guarded. "I've heard of your grandfather. He was a talented man, though we never crossed paths personally. But I do recall your mother speaking highly of him. Do you know anything else about their connection?" Emily asked, her voice filled with urgency. "Anything that could help us understand why this melody is so important?" Charles paused, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. "There are things I've never spoken of, Victor. Things I've kept hidden because they were complicated. Your mother and your grandfather had a bond, yes, but it wasn't just one of mentorship. There was an unspoken understanding between them, an understanding that extended far beyond music." Victor's brow furrowed. "What are you saying, father?" Charles leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Your mother was more than just a student of your grandfather's. She was in love with him. It was a love neither of them could act on, for reasons neither ever shared with me. But it was a connection that shaped your mother's life in ways that I only came to understand when she passed." Emily's heart skipped a beat as the truth began to unfold. The love between her grandfather and Victor's mother, the relationship that had never come to fruition, had been a secret, a bond too strong to be forgotten, too powerful to be erased by time. "I never wanted to stir up old wounds," Charles continued, "but now that this melody has resurfaced, I realize that it was their way of keeping a piece of their connection alive. Your grandfather and your mother, Emily, they created something beautiful together, something that transcended time, something that has led us here today. The revelation was staggering. Emily could hardly breathe as she absorbed the weight of what Charles had just revealed. The melody was not just a piece of music. It was a testament to a lost love, a connection that had bridged generations, a legacy that had shaped both their families in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. Victor reached for Emily's hand, his grip strong and steady. "We've come so far, Emily. This melody, this legacy, it's more than just a song. It's our past, our future, and our bond." Emily looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just the man who had once seemed distant and cold, but the person who shared her journey, the person who had become an integral part of her story. Together, they had uncovered a truth that had been buried for decades, a truth that would change both their lives forever. The melody, the love, the history, these were the threads that wove their destinies together. And as Emily looked toward the future, she knew that the music would guide them, as it had always done. The discovery was complete, but their journey had only just begun. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was now part of their shared legacy, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. As the years passed, the melody continued to echo through their lives, a constant reminder of the bond that had once seemed so distant and improbable. Emily and Victor, now both deeply immersed in the world of music, found themselves not just as collaborators, but as co-creators of a legacy that transcended time and hardship. The discoveries they had made together, about their families, about the love that had shaped their destinies, had forged a path forward, one where the past and present intertwined seamlessly. Emily's performances grew more powerful, filled with the depth of the legacy she had come to understand, and the wisdom of her grandfather's teachings. Victor, ever by her side, found a new sense of purpose, not just as a conductor, but as a man who had come to terms with the untold stories of his mother's life. Their collaboration led to the creation of a new symphony, one that told the story of their family's intertwined histories, a symphony inspired by the melody that had begun it all. The piece premiered to great acclaim, hailed as one of the most emotional and groundbreaking performances of the century. And through it all, Emily and Victor knew that their shared journey was more than just about music. It was about healing, about uncovering hidden truths, and about the love that had been passed down through the generations. In the end, the melody was more than just notes on a page. It was the story of two souls bound together by fate, music, and a love that had never truly been forgotten. And as the final note echoed through the concert hall, both Emily and Victor understood that they had found something far more precious than success or fame. They had found each other, and the melody would always be theirs to carry, to honor, and to share with the world. Their journey was far from over, but they knew one thing for certain. The music, and the love it represented, would guide them wherever they went. And so, the melody lived on, forever a part of their lives, forever a part of their hearts. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the entire story. Your support means the world, and I hope you enjoyed the journey as much as I did sharing it with you. If you like the story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to stay updated with more amazing content. Your likes and subscriptions help keep the stories coming. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love hearing from you. And if you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends so they can enjoy it too. Thank you again for being part of this experience. See you in the next one.